Most importantly though, it's an environment where, it's an environment where the children and the adults can have this friendly interaction. So the children feel an important part of the local community. Now, if you get back to our world, in our world, cheap oil has allowed us to create very child-hostile cities, cities that aren't child-friendly. And what it's done is it has allowed us to replace children's freedoms and their playful activity with dependent mobility and adult organised activities. And you can see this clearly in data from Essendon in Melbourne, and you can get similar data from the rest of Australia. But between 1974 and 2005, there was a huge increase in the number of children driven to school. There were sharp declines in walking and public transport. The only bit of good news here is that the number of children cycling stayed relatively stable. So we can ask, why is that freedom and connection important? And it's important for a whole range of reasons, and not just for the children. So let's have a look at the costs of the loss of children's freedom. First of all, for the parents. Those of you who are parents will know that there's an enormous amount of time and money involved in transporting and supervising children, and there's enormous amounts of oil involved in that as well. There's traffic congestion and pollution costs, so there's costs for the environment. The community suffers as well, because if you haven't got children and adults out there in the local streets, then you don't develop a sense of local neighbourhood-based community. And children are very effective at breaking down that natural reserve between adults. And let's look at the costs for children. What are the costs for children of not letting children play freely or explore their local environment? Well, here's a list, and it's not a comprehensive list, but it gives you some idea. They're not getting enough exercise, they're getting fat, they're not developing properly, there's traffic dangers, there's increased stranger danger because there's no one around on the streets to keep an eye out for them, there's pollution, there's lack of a sense of place, and we're depriving children of joy and wonder, and I'll come back to that point because I think that's critical. The benefits, well, we keep children safe, but do we really? Well, only in a very narrow, individualistic and short-term sense. In the long term, we're exposing children to a whole range of health problems which might be more serious than the dangers that we're protecting them from. I'll talk about that loss of joy and wonder. There's a wonderful researcher in Canada, Dr. Catherine O'Brien, who goes along to transport conferences and she listens to engineers and economists talk about the efficiency of transport networks and cost-benefit analysis, and she says, "Excuse me, have you factored in the loss of children's joy and wonder?" And people look at her and think, well, what planet are you on, lady? But she brings them around and she gets them to realise that as adults, even when we walk down to the local shops, we're locked into this mechanistic view that we've got to get to the shops, get the bread, the milk and the newspaper and get back on with the next task. Because the next task is always more important than the present. But children don't do that. On their way to the shops, they want to dawdle, they want to experience the joy and wonder of patting the neighbour's cat and kicking through the autumn leaves and enjoying that experience. And I think we can learn a lot from children about living in the present, or living in the nowscape as it's called. So how do we make our cities more child-friendly? There's three things we should do: changing urban form and transport, improving the design of neighbourhoods, and changes in social values. I'll just talk briefly about each of those. We know that if we have schools and shops and services closer to children's homes, children are more likely to be allowed to walk and cycle to those places. Cheap oil has allowed us to close schools and shops and local services. We also need to invest in transport modes other than the car. So the child-friendly transport modes, and this is no surprise if you think about it, are walking, as in this walking school bus, cycling, and you can cycle from a very young age, and public transport. And these are the child-friendly modes because children can use them independently, but when adults use these modes, it doesn't make the city less child-friendly. In fact, the more people you have out there walking and cycling with children, the more conducive it is for children to do the same. Improving the design of neighbourhoods. This is all those fine detail issues that improve children's freedom and safety and connection. So one of the things we need to do is improve children's freedom of, or safety from the traffic. And we've made a start in Australia, but people from Germany come out here and laugh at our speed limits. They think 50 kilometres an hour is ridiculously fast. 40 kilometres an hour past a school, ridiculous. So we've got a long way to go, but we've made a start. We need to improve the feelings of safety and connections, and we should avoid streetscapes like that. This is out of Melbourne. There's a lot of houses in the street like this. They have all these shutters. There's no sense of passive surveillance. And I'll bet those roller doors have got automatic controllers on them as well. We need to change social values, and there's 3 social values that we need to think about. We need to slow down, not just slow down the cars, but slow our whole lives down. Challenge the view that speed is good. And I was interested to hear the reference to the Formula 1 race. Ban motor racing, that'd be a good start. Moving from individualism to a greater collective responsibility, absolutely critical. And challenge the notion of what it means to be a good parent. And if you're thinking about these things, you'll probably realise that they're all related. There's a wonderful book by Carl Honore called In Praise of Slow. And in that book, he explains that children aren't born obsessed with speed. We make them that way. When I was reading his book, I felt very guilty when he said the most common phrase he used when he was bringing up his children was, and you can probably guess, hurry up. Yeah, come on, hurry up. So we need to get out of that mindset. He said children need time for unstructured play, and he was very clear on what unstructured play was. He said it's not ballet, it's not soccer, it's digging for worms, exploring the world and your own reaction to it at your own speed. So we need to give children time to be slow. We also need to move from individualism to a greater collective responsibility, which means that we need to recognise the collective impacts of all the individual decisions that we make. And I don't think this is anywhere clearer than in the parents who make the individual decision to drive their children to school to protect them from the traffic dangers that are created by the parents who drive their children to school. So we need to break out of that social trap, and the way to do that is to get that collective agreement to look after everyone's children, and that's what things like the walking school bus are all about. And the last one, and you'll see that this is related to the first 2, is challenging what it means to be a good parent. At the moment, a lot of parents think that the best parent is the parent who drives their children from one activity to another activity, so they're going across the city and across the city. But I think we can learn from Fiona Stanley's book, Children of the Lucky Country, where she says we should value childhoods for children rather than for adults. And I think what she means by that is that instead of preparing children for life in a consumerist world, which may not exist after peak oil, just let them go and play in the mud and they're probably going to learn a lot more. Now, I'll go back to Monsters Inc. The monsters learn from a human child how to solve their energy crisis. And if you think about learning from a human child, then relate that to the real world, what we're going to need in the real world to cope with peak oil is the sort of creativity and openness to new ideas that comes from children. So we need to involve children and young people in the solution to peak oil. In other words, we need to treat children as capable social actors. Rather than seeing children just as vulnerable, we need to see them as part of the solution. But the key message from Monsters Inc. is not so much that we need to involve children in the solution to peak oil, but it's how we treat children, the treatment of children. In the movie, the evil monster Watermoose has this evil plot to kidnap children, strap them into a scream extractor machine and torture them and get the scream energy from them. So he's going to kidnap 1,000 children and do anything he can to keep his energy company going. Fortunately, in the movie, because it's a Disney movie, James P. Sullivan, the big friendly monster, saves Boo, the human child, and foils this evil plot. But so the key message is that any solution that relies on the oppression of children has been put on notice. I'd like now to go back to George W. Bush and his war in Iraq, and I'd like you to assume, just for a minute, that this war in Iraq had something to do with oil. And now, if we make that assumption, we can then ask, did this war lead to the oppression and even the deaths of human children? And we all know it did. Some people may not be aware of the numbers of children involved, but we may be talking about hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children who have died unnecessarily because of that war. So clearly we have an energy policy that's leading to the death and oppression of children. So rather than having an energy policy that leads to the oppression and the deaths of human children, what we need is an energy policy that leads to children's well-being. In other words, what we need in our world is the equivalent of laughter energy.